Well, yeah, thank you so much again for joining us today. Yeah, it's been a really exciting weekend so far. Hope you guys are building some amazing things. Now we're going to be talking about building in the open source space, and I'm really excited to have the founder of the company that I'm currently with, called Tea, and it's going to be Max Howell, who also created Mac OS package manager Homebrew back in the day, which quickly scaled to basically being one of the most contributed projects in the open source space back in the day. Sorry. and yeah, so really excited to have Max here. He's really been a prominent figure in the open source space since back in about 2008, and he's been really trying to figure this thing out as to how we can properly reward people in the space and to give them proper respect and attribution as to the things that they're building, because that's a really difficult problem to solve in the open source space. So yeah, really excited to have Max here today. He's a really inspiring figure, and really just great to see now with T how we can really give back to the people that have built thanklessly for so many years.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'm only here virtually, but really happy to be here today to talk about T and what we're trying to do for open source. I'm Max Howell, created Homebrew back in the day, some time ago now. I'll tell you more about it later. Currently co-founder and core contributor to T Protocol. Let me move that. So back in 2009, I created Homebrew. I've been into open source for 20 years at this point. I didn't think I was going to be a programmer. I remember back when I was 16 going to a job fair, not entirely sure what I was going to do with myself. And I met a lot of people doing different professions. But I only remember the programmers because they freaked me out. They were just overall too geeky for me, and I was a sensitive teenager at the time. But I also remember how passionate they were about what they did, the kind of passion that just didn't resonate with any of the other people I talked to. However, I decided to be a scientist. So I did a chemistry degree, and about a year into the chemistry degree, I realized that I'd made a big mistake. The truth was that the science movies I'd seen as a kid didn't really reflect the true nature of science, and there wasn't much innovation going on. So I got a little depressed about it, went home and installed Linux on my home computer. And that's when I discovered open source. I discovered all these communities that together were trying to build something that would change the world, that would make it better, that would improve it in ways that were tangible. At the time, open source was mostly considered a hobby, and no one was really building on it. Web 1 didn't really build on open source. Everyone was trying to get Linux and open source in general used in more places, but it just wasn't really happening. I managed to get into the industry via open source. One of my projects that I built resonated with a company in London where I lived at the time, and they offered me a job. So I've never had a computer science degree or anything, which has some amusing stories attached with it, but managed to get into the industry via open source, and I feel like I'm a poster child for that in that respect. It was while I was there that I built Homebrew. I was working on all the apps at this company. There were six, one for Windows, one for Mac, one for Linux, one for iPhone, one for Android, and there was also a BlackBerry app. Fortunately, BlackBerry doesn't exist anymore because I got to say it was the worst platform to work for. And we used Mac as the unified platform for all this development because it was, well, partly because of Apple's lock-in with working on Mac and iPhone apps, but it was also, we liked it. It was nice. At the time, using Mac as a developer platform wasn't really that common. Like, I used to get a lot of stick, actually, from co-workers because we liked it. The package manager solutions on Mac at the time weren't great. And so I used to complain about this a lot to my co-workers because it was interfering with our productivity. And one of my co-workers in the end got fed up with my incessant whinging and challenged me to do something about it. So I did. I used all the experience I had with different package managers and different systems. I loved like so many of them, and built something new. And like most open source projects, when you start building them, no one really knows about it. So for a few months, it was just me working on this thing. This is a representation of the Git commits over the first few years of Homebrew. But open source doesn't have marketing, so you have to talk about it. And so I talked about it, and then it got on Hacker News, which was a bit new at the time. And suddenly I found that I built something that kind of was going viral. It was insane how popular it got, how quickly. And I rapidly realized that this was what I wanted to work on full time. I found that open source was the most valuable thing for me to work on. It was the way for me to give the most value to the world. It was a passion project which I was spending all my evenings and weekends on. After a while, I decided I would quit and try to work on it full time. Because you look at this many contributions, it was necessary. And it was over the years of me working full time on open source, running out of money, finding contract work, finding startups to work at. I had a little stint at Apple as well, where I couldn't work on open source; they prohibited it, and I found myself in this endless cycle between open source and work that paid. It's been a feature of my career the whole time. And something's not right with that, because the truth is that over the last 15 years that I built Homebrew in, Web 2 has discovered that open source is a great way to have 95% of your stack maintained for free by other people. And no one went into open source, and nobody still does, expecting anything from it. It's things that we want to build. But the value from Web 2 just hasn't trickled back into the open source that they consume. I had a great conversation with Isaac, who's the founder of NPM, yesterday, in fact, where he said that if he hadn't been able to work on NPM full time for those first few years, then NPM wouldn't exist. And how much value has been created on the likes of these kinds of projects. Homebrew and NPM are like the base of a lot of people's stacks. Huge amounts of commercial software is built using these tools. Value just doesn't trickle down. The open source maintainers cannot capture the value that they create. And nowadays, 97% of commercial code contains open source. We consider this a problem, obviously, in terms of the fact that these maintainers are struggling, but also it's making the internet fragile. We call it the Nebraska Project after this famous XKCD comic from about the same time that I released Homebrew. It's old. Like, people know this problem and have known this problem for a long time now. See, open source is built in these kinds of cycles where we build out the tools that we need at the time, that based on the ideas that people are having in the software industry as a whole. And then everyone builds on top of those things. And some of these projects get left behind. They're not well known. They're not the sexy infrastructure layer at the top. They're the unsexy infrastructure layer right in the middle. The XKCD comic describes this with this tree of bricks that are built on top of each other. And some of these bricks are fragile. And the comic says this project in particular, this little pillar holding everything up, is like some random project that someone from Nebraska has been thanklessly maintaining since 2003. And like, maintainers like myself burn out because there isn't an incentive. There isn't a correct set of incentives to work on open source. I burned out on Homebrew after a few years and handed it to the community, which fortunately had developed because of my guidance. And then here we have like a great quote from the Core.js maintainer. Core.js is used by 80% of the top 100 websites in the world. It's pretty difficult to build a Node application without Core.js, is the truth of it. And this quote is, "I'm effing tired. Free open source software is fundamentally broken. Companies that save and earn many millions of dollars on Core.js usage just ignore funding requests. I have good job offers, but if I accept a full-time offer, Core.js will become just useless and die." Personally, I had this happen to me as well. Like, I was maintaining this project called PromiseKit, which was used by 100,000 apps, including the likes of Uber and McDonald's and Netflix. And I never so much as got a free Big Mac for this. And I burned out on it. And it's kind of stagnant to this day. I occasionally pop in to see what is going on, but I don't have the capability of working on it. And then a couple of years ago, we had Log4j, which is this typical Nebraska project that hardly anyone knew about. And this massive root exploit was found in it. And suddenly all these enterprise servers were rootable with 0-day. They got a lot of aggro for this. So they went on Twitter and said, look, we're unpaid volunteers who work on this in our own time. We're sorry about the bug. We'll fix it. But maybe after this, you could consider funding us a little bit. And they still have no tangible amount of funding. I've spoken to hundreds of open source developers over the last few months to tell them about tea. And the one that I found that was making the most with sponsorship was making $24,000 a year. And where he lived, that just wasn't enough. It couldn't really even pay his rent. I personally tried to make things work with that kind of route as well. And I'll tell you about that in a sec. Another great example is FFmpeg, which powers all online video. And they tweet this every now and again to remind everyone that they power all online video, but yet they're not sufficiently funded to be able to maintain it. So that was a couple of years ago that I was once again in between open source and full-time work. And I looked at what was there. As I said, tried the sponsorship model a few years before. I had a Patreon and I tried to get the amount of Patreon sponsorship I was up to the amount where I could pay my rent, at least. That was my goal, to pay my rent. And after about 6 months, I wasn't halfway there. And I realized that I was spending 50 to 60% of my time marketing myself, and that this is not what I wanted to do. I wanted to work on open source, and that's what the world needed me to do, to work on open source. And yet I was spending all my time there. And so I looked at what the new solutions existed, and I didn't see anything that fundamentally changed that narrative, that stated that open source is not a charity. Open source is fundamental infrastructure that nowadays powers all modern software. It's been to Mars, it's in every computer, it's in every phone, it's everywhere. Everyone builds on top of it, and yet that value just doesn't trickle down. So I looked into what could be done with crypto, something I wasn't as familiar with as I am now, for sure. And I saw potential there. I realized that over the last 25, 30 years, open source maintainers have been creating this graph of reputable data using package managers. When you make a new project, you choose your dependencies. Everyone builds on top of the shoulders of the giants before on all these Nebraska projects. And when you're choosing those dependencies, you're basically saying that your project's reputation depends on the reputation of the projects you're depending on. And with that, I saw that we could rank open source projects and using token distribute rewards proportionate with everyone's impact. I also saw that open source slots into the Web3 model really, really well. The fact is that the reason that existing solutions aren't working well is because the system of economics they're building on top of just doesn't understand how open source works, and it doesn't understand how to support it. The only solution anyone's been able to come up with is sponsorship, charity, and grants. There's also commercial open source now. And it doesn't work with the open source model, in my opinion. Whenever you see a commercial open source project, you see that the agenda is driven by their need to make revenue. And that means a business model. Open source shouldn't have to have a business model. It's providing immense value that needs to be rewarded just for continuing to do that. You also see companies hiring open source maintainers in order to work on projects because they know these projects need to exist. But that introduces agenda. The company has desire for features in these projects, and that pushes the project towards that company's needs and not the open source community's needs. Open source is incredibly meritocratic in that respect. You build something, you solve a problem, and if you're not solving that problem, then people fork it or make something new. And that is how it needs to continue to work. Web3 can fix that. I saw that tokenization can empower developers to contribute to open source while reaping overdue rewards. I saw how token and Web3 and blockchain technologies could introduce a new kind of economics that was catered specifically to open source and thus fix the Nebraska problem. So I founded Tea about 2.5 years ago now, managed to raise a bunch of money, and we spent the last 2 years building it out, designing a tokenomics model that is sustainable for rewarding open source, but also inviting everybody else in the world to participate in the value of the open source ecosystem. Our main mission, of course, is to make open source sustainable, but as a side effect, we see it as possible to bring on the 2.2 million Web 2 open source developers to Web 3. There's 2.2 million open source developers in Web 2, and there's about 60,000 in Web 3. Like the numbers are really quite slanted. And these developers don't exactly understand Web 3, but we believe that our solution is a thing that they will, that resonates with them. Like we have on our testnet already 15,000 open source projects that have signed up, because they see what we're building as one of the first utility use cases for crypto that resonates with them, that makes sense. That's what they told me directly. Tea is composed of four major pieces. Firstly, the Tea token rewards. If you onboard your open source project, we reward you every 24 hours with Tea token based on the rank of your project. The ranking of the projects is computed using what we call proof of contribution, which is running on our oracle that computes what we call T ranks for every open source project that exists. Currently, we have 5.5 million open source projects that our proof of contribution algorithm is computing ranks for. Ranks range from 0 to 100. The higher your rank, the higher your daily rewards. We also believe in the on-chain governance of what we've built. The Tea protocol is being launched by a non-profit Swiss association. It is currently run by people who understand open source. The longer term, open source maintainers with token will be able to vote on proposals or propose proposals. And we want them to be the governing directors of the Tea protocol. This is an open source project built for open source project, the open source community, and governed by the open source community. There's no outside interests to direct it. Something that you can only really do with Web3 technologies. And we also, excuse me, my camera's gone off. There we go. We also believe that what we're building appeals to people who aren't familiar with open source. If you're an open source maintainer, we are providing great incentives to work on open source. If you're a developer, you can participate in the open source ecosystem's value. And if you're not even a developer, the same applies. So far, we've had over 900,000 people sign up for our testnet, and only a third of these have a verified GitHub account. The crypto community in general sees the value of what we're trying to build and wants to participate. As I say, our testnet's been live just over 7 weeks now, and we have 900,000 wallets on chain interacting. 83% of them are active. 15,000 open source projects have onboarded, more and more every day. That represents almost 2% of all the T rank we've computed for those 5.5 million open source projects. Onboarding to T is very simple. We understand that there's 2.2 million open source developers who don't understand Web3 technologies that want to onboard. So we've used new technologies like account abstraction and paymasters in order to make the process as simple and as Web 2-like as possible. We've received a huge amount of praise for our user experience. People see it as being something that's very smooth and very easy to understand. If you are an open source maintainer, onboarding your project is also very simple. I'm a big believer in making things as simple as possible at those beginning pieces if you want people to participate. It was one of the reasons that Homebrew was so successful. You just onboard using your Google account because of account abstraction. Then you find your project and you decide if you're the only maintainer for that project. If there's multiple people, then you can add them at that point. We then create a project treasury. This isn't a personal treasury, it's for the project. And we create a T constitution file for you that describes the members of the project. You then commit that file to your repository. It's a YAML file. By committing it, you prove you have the ability to commit, and thus you are someone who can control that project. then within 24 hours, we will have indexed you and you'll start receiving rewards. It's really very simple. Fundamentally, we feel that T fixes the Nebraska problem without changing the fundamental nature of open source software. Reminder, the Nebraska problem is that these projects that sit deep in the stack receive no funding and the developers are burning out, which is leading to security issues across the industry. It's really coming to a crux right now. The last 15 years is just escalated and escalated. Just a few weeks ago, there was a massive issue with XZ that I'm sure many of you heard about. XZ is this fundamental library used by tons and tons of software for compression. The maintainer burned out a couple of years ago. He just couldn't maintain the project because the incentives weren't aligned correctly for him to do so. He burned out. He passed the project to someone he thought he could trust, someone who'd spent a couple of years building up trust with him that he was someone who could take over the project. But it turned out the person he passed it to was nefarious, that they were some kind of state-sponsored actor, and they injected a massive backdoor into the library because they had maintainer access. T is going to make it possible for people like the XZ maintainer to not burn out. We've looked at the rewards that projects are getting right now, and it's looking very promising for what will happen when we go to mainnet later this year, June or July, most likely. And also fundamentally, we're not changing the nature of open source software. It would be devastating to me if we changed how open source works. Open source works. It creates incredible, valuable pieces of software that everyone builds on top of. There's just one glaring issue, that it's not sustainable, that the people who maintain it burn out, that they aren't incentivized correctly to maintain the software when it becomes used by Web2 and enterprise. Because at that point, they're just getting angry bug reports from these companies without the companies putting their money where their mouth is. If we look at some of the Web2 companies that do donate to open source, let's consider Airbnb, for example. They put $150,000 a year in, which isn't bad in the scheme of things. As company donations go, that's high. And yet Airbnb make 15 cents for every dollar that consumers spend worldwide. They really could put more in. The problem is the incentives for Airbnb aren't there. They consider open source a charity because that's all that people can consider it. At T, we're changing the narrative. Open source isn't a charity. It's fundamental infrastructure that creates enormous value. And we're persuading the crypto community to see that value, that open source as a whole represents some percentage of the entire software industry's value. And T protocol unlocks that value. However, it would be devastating, as I say, if we changed anything else about open source, which is why we so carefully designed the tokenomics of T, so that open source maintainers are rewarded without really having to do anything else that's different. And everyone else who wants to participate, there is a bunch of DeFi systems that we built so that it can stake against projects, report security vulnerabilities, and other utility functions are coming over the next 3 to 4 years that we're incredibly excited about, that we believe will allow the tokenomics to have high value without changing the fundamental nature of open source software. So thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope to see you on testnet. Let's get us up to the 1 million wallets onboarded before we go live with mainnet later this year. I'm available for questions now if anyone has any.
So thank you so much, Max, for the presentation. And if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. I will walk up to you.
Thank you. Hi, Anna here. First, I wanted to say thank you. I think what you do is incredible. It's absolutely mind-blowing. And I myself am a heavy Linux homebrew user, so that just, blew my mind that you just kept that going for so long. I have a somewhat out-of-topic question. Because I see another incredible angle with this sustainable tokenomics thing you got going on here. So there is a whole invisible world of writers and artists and creators who create things like characters or like entire worlds and make them immediately available as Creative Commons or even as public domain. They're not like hogging them as IP, which allows other people to create and remix and contribute to the growing narrative. It's the difference between nobody can make a Marvel movie except Marvel, but anybody can make a Sherlock Holmes movie and benefit from it. But that took like hundreds of years or like a long time before it went public. Do you think that this model could also potentially be used in that way to benefit and inspire more artists going into commons, Creative Commons or public domains, just to keep the flow of creativity going and not hog copyright so much, which, you know, just hurts creativity a lot?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And certainly, as we've been building out T protocol, we've realized that this model can apply to other areas. I hadn't thought of that one, but it seems like a great example. I have thought that maybe science could use something like this, right? Like, I think the truth is, as a scientist, I've seen how scientific research and papers that are released aren't quite incentivized with the way science should work. They're chasing citations rather than chasing truth some of the time. So yeah, I see that this model could be adapted, and I really hope that people will take the example of what we're doing once they see it being successful later this year and figure out ways to apply it to other things. And yeah, your example seems like a great thing. Maybe you should go away and do that, read our white paper and see how you can translate it.
Thank you.
Hello, Victoria. I'm just curious, since you're building T protocol as a Web3 protocol, and you're addressing open source developers, how easy or difficult it is to bring this to like non-Web3 native developers? Like, is it easy due to account abstraction, or do you see some challenges there? I'm just curious to know.
Yeah, so certainly we found it challenging using new technologies, and we used too many, I think. But it was very important to us that we make this accessible to people who aren't familiar with Web3, because that is our target audience. Like Web3 open source projects can onboard to the T protocol, but the truth is Web3 already figured out incentivization, right? And Web 2 is where there is need for these incentives. So yeah, it was complicated, but if you have the right team, these technologies are well documented, and you just have trouble finding other people who can give you help. But we've had great partnerships with other Web3 shops. We're built on Base, and we have a great relationship with Base, and they have great devs that have helped us along the way. So yeah, definitely doable.
Awesome, thanks.
I have this kind of question, like if at the moment those big companies or big players, they don't donate to the open source, where will the liquidity pool come in your case?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I talked to the head of open source at Sentry a couple of months back, and he spends a lot of time trying to get companies to donate to open source because he sees that as the route. These companies are making a lot of money off open source after all, so they should be. We see it differently, that our route to liquidity is by attracting the interest of the crypto community in general. And I think we've had great success there. We have over 1 million people on our email waitlist and almost 1 million people signed up and onboarded onto the testnet. And so our strategy is to give them the right narrative that makes sense, that resonates, that persuades them that it's worthy of their money going into the protocol. And that is by saying that open source already is a killer app. That you can see that it has created the entire internet and the software industry. And we've created DeFi systems so that they can participate and be rewarded alongside the open source projects that they stake their token against, or they report issues against, or the other things we have coming later in the next 3 to 4 years that I cannot yet talk about, but they're good ideas for generating additional utility on top. Now, I do see companies participating. It's just going to take longer. What I see happening is that once we go live later this year, there'll be some great success stories from open source maintainers about how Tea has changed what they can do with their lives. More and more open source projects will onboard as a result, because honestly, it's a bit of a no-brainer for them to do so. As that happens, it will be possible for them to put in their READMEs that they won't provide support to companies that don't stake against their projects, because we've made it so simple for them to do so. And at that point, I see it being like a business decision for those companies to make. This isn't a donation, this is a business decision. And we'll start seeing pressure from the community, both the open source maintainers. One thing I know about open source maintainers is they're highly influential in the development space. When a major open source maintainer says something, everyone starts to take note. When you drive the developers at these companies to feel that there's an obligation to participate in Tea protocol, they will put pressure on their managers and that will filter up. But one of the great things about what we're building, I think, is that we don't need the Web2 companies and enterprise companies to participate over the next couple of years in order for it to be successful. I hope that answers your question.
Hey, Max. As far as I understood, proof of contribution, super cool, by the way. I think that you guys took a lot of ideas from SourceCred, DevRank, and other pretty cool experiments from before. The question is, proof of contribution takes a look at value identification on the global perspective of projects. Are you guys also planning to tackle local value identification with projects and contributors?
When you say local, do you mean projects that aren't open source and they're just on someone's computer, or do you mean something else?
Basically to understand how much a specific contributor impacted the project.
Oh, I see. Yes. So longer term, we would love to do some proof of humanity at work where we show how developers individually how impactful they are to open source. But that isn't part of our initial mission. Our initial mission is to fix the Nebraska problem on a project basis, which is why we create a project treasury. And then if you're going to transfer those rewards to specific people, we're leaving that up to you initially, at least, in how you choose to transfer those rewards. I think people can do some really interesting things with smart contracts in that space. And since we're primarily an open source project, we expect the open source community to produce some very interesting contracts that can, for example, set aside some of the treasury for merged pull requests, thus incentivizing contribution from a wider community than actually happens right now because the incentives are so poor. But yeah, like longer term, individual developers, we'd love to do that, where you get a page on Tea that says just how impactful you are on a global scale for your individual contributions to open source.
Anyone else? No? Okay, Ashton.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks so much, Max. Really appreciate your time and joining us in virtually. It seemed to go pretty smooth, which is great. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day. In North Carolina there, I believe he is. Yeah, all the way out here in Estonia, hearing him well, which is great. But yeah, thanks so much, Max. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.